The Battle of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address. In June of 1863, Robert E. Lee, in command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, decided to repeat his strategy of September 1862 when he had invaded northern-held territory. That is, he had gone off of the defensive strategy and taken to the offensive. This is a risk. Why does he do this? He hoped that a Southern victory on northern soil would inflame the anti-war sentiment that was beginning to set in the North. The war had not been going well for the North, largely because of Lee. And so there were many Northerners who were beginning to voice, so what are we doing? How come we are fighting this war? Perhaps we should just let the Southerners go. Anti-war sentiment. Lee believes that if he can win a victory on northern soil, that anti-war sentiment would blossom right into a major movement, and then might lead to a negotiated peace in which the Southerners won their freedom. Secondly, and this is related, he hopes that a Southern victory on northern soil will lead to foreign recognition of the independence of the Southern states, that Britain and France would recognize and maybe even help then the Confederacy. And so the two armies, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac, shadowed each other for days as the Confederates marched north out of Virginia, crossing Maryland, and then into the northern state of Pennsylvania. Eventually, they found each other, quite by accident, at the town of Gettysburg in southern Pennsylvania on July 1st, 1863. On that day, Southern forces came into the town of Gettysburg in greater strength than the Northern forces had there. In fact, the Southern forces had actually largely marched past Gettysburg into the north and then turned around and came back to the south to come into Gettysburg. And one of the reasons was they had heard, that is, the Southerners had heard, that there was a shoe factory in Gettysburg. And about a third of the Johnny Rebs marched into the north that year in their bare feet. So a shoe factory was something significant. And as I said, on the first day of battle, the Confederates arrived in greater strength and drove the Union forces that were in the town south, back up on a ridge behind the town. Cemetery Ridge. In the night, both armies arrived in force. The next day, Lee ordered his favorite strategy, a flank attack. And indeed, he attacked both the Union right and the Union left. And both of these attacks were very, very close to victory. On the Union left flank, there was a hill called Little Round Top. And Southern soldiers had been trying to flank the Union soldiers on that little hill all day long. Late in the day, the 20th Maine Regiment, about 300 and some odd men, arrived at the end of the Union line, the last regiment in line, to reinforce the Union position on top of the little hill. The 20th Maine's commander, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, was given the order to hold that position at all hazards. No retreat. Retreat is not an option. For to lose that spot on the end of the Union line would mean that the Southerners had flanked the Union Army and now would roll down and rout the Union Army from the south. The Southerners repeatedly battered the 20th Maine. Still they held. The Confederates, men from Alabama, tried to get around the flank. Chamberlain extended his men still further, but in doing that, weakening the position that he was holding because he's lengthened his lines and he hasn't added any men to his position. Civil War historian James McPherson describes what happened next. Posted at the far left of this brigade was the 20th Maine, commanded by Colonel Joshua Chamberlain. A year earlier, Chamberlain had been a professor of rhetoric and modern languages at Bowdoin College. So you can see why Chamberlain has always been a favorite of mine. College professor. Taking a leave of absence, ostensibly to study in Europe. So he told the administration he was going to go to Europe to study. No problem with that. Instead, he joined the Union Army. And now found himself responsible for preventing the rebels from rolling up the Union flank. The fighting professor and his Downeasterners proved equal to the occasion. For nearly 2 hours, they stood off repeated assaults by portions of several Confederate regiments along the rocky, wooded slope filled with smoke, noise, and terror. But their valor seemed in vain. With more than a third of his men down and the remainder out of ammunition, and with the Johnnies forming for another assault, Chamberlain was in a tight spot. But cool and quick-witted, perhaps a legacy of dealing with fractious students. No, he actually wrote that. McPherson now, all right? So we got 3 professors here. We've got Chamberlain, we've got McPherson, and, well, you have me, the runt of the group. He ordered his men to fix bayonets on their empty rifles and charge. With a yell, these smoke-grimed Yanks lurched downhill against the surprised rebels. Exhausted by their uphill fighting, following a 25-mile march the day before, and shocked by the audacity of this bayonet assault, the Alabamians surrendered by scores to the jubilant boys from Maine. Little Round Top remained in Northern hands. Round Top was secure. But the battle was not over. Lee would not retreat. He was sure another attack the next day, the 3rd day of the battle, on the center of the Union lines would break the Union lines and still result in a victory for the Southerners. And fighting in the morning of the 3rd day was inconclusive. A calm settled over the battlefield, as if the armies had called a truce for lunch. General George Meade's Union Army held the high ground all along Cemetery Ridge for miles. And a mile of open field separated the Union soldiers on top of that ridge from the Confederate soldiers in the wood across the way. Now General James Longstreet, who had taken General Jackson's place as Lee's right-hand man, once more urged the great general to maneuver around Meade's left, to effectively retreat from the Battle of Gettysburg, move south, and then east, and find some ground advantageous to the Southerners and hold that ground between the Union Army and Washington, D.C., and force the Union Army to come up the hill and take them off the high ground. Because it's much easier to be above your enemy than it is to be below them. So this is Longstreet's advice. Again, Lee refuses and ordered Longstreet to attack the Union center with Pickett's division and 2 of Hill's, fewer than 15,000 men, to advance 3/4 of a mile across open fields and assault dug-in infantry supported by ample artillery. General Lee. Longstreet later said that he told the general, "There never was a body of 15,000 men who could make that attack successfully." So the 2 Southern generals are disagreeing over strategy here. Lee impatiently replied that his magnificent army had done it before and could do it again. "My heart was heavy," wrote Longstreet later on. "I could see the desperate and hopeless nature of the charge and the hopeless slaughter it would cause. That day at Gettysburg was one of the saddest days of my life." In this mood, Longstreet ordered a concentration of Confederate artillery, some 150 field guns, for the largest Southern bombardment of the war, to soften up the enemy at the point of attack in the center of the Union lines. Longstreet's guns shattered the uneasy silence that had followed the morning fight. And the Union guns responded, so 300 guns going off for 2 hours. The sound of this thunder could be heard 100 miles away. About 3 in the afternoon, Confederate General George Pickett and his fresh division, a division that had not been involved in the fight before this, supported by 2 other divisions now, we're going to cross that open field. They're going to come out of the woods. They're going to come out in fine order and cross that field and break the Union lines in the center. This is Pickett's charge. It is easily the most famous and forlorn charge in American military history. Pickett's valiant soldiers managed to gain the top of the ridge. They even crossed some of the stone walls in some places and engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the Union soldiers. But the men in blue would not yield. Reinforcements cut down the Southerners, closed the breach, and sent the Confederates streaming back down the slope. When it was clear that Pickett's charge had failed, Lee rode out from the woods out into the field and met his returning soldiers, and he took off his hat and he waved it at them and he said, "It is all my fault. It is all my fault." Lee was defeated at Gettysburg, but not broken. War's not over. Meade, the Union general, was victorious, but his army was badly hurt. Heavy casualties. Now he refuses to chase Lee and hopefully annihilate his army, as Lee would struggle then to cross the rivers back into Virginia. It was a great mistake. I don't know of any military historian who studied this campaign who doesn't think that Meade should have tried to destroy what was left of Lee's army as they retreated. And so Lee's army would survive to fight again. And the war would go on for 2 more years. So the Battle of Gettysburg, we now know, was a turning point of the war, and it comes almost exactly in the middle of the war. It's not the end. Indeed, at the time, Americans of both North and South did not realize that the Battle of Gettysburg was the turning point of the war. It could only be truly seen from the perspective of time. But they did know that they had won, the Northerners did know that they had won a great victory. This was so different from the battles that had gone before. Writer George Templeton Strong wrote, once he'd heard of this Union victory at Gettysburg, "The results of this victory are priceless. The charm of Robert E. Lee's invincibility is broken. The Army of the Potomac," that's the Northern Army now, "the Army of the Potomac has at last found a general, Meade, that can handle it, and has stood nobly up to its terrible work in spite of its long, disheartening list of hard-fought failures. Copperheads are palsied." Copperheads are those who live in the North but are sympathetic to the South. "Copperheads are palsied and dumb for the moment at least. The federal government, the Union government, is strengthened fourfold at home and abroad. Anti-war sentiment, instead of rising, is falling." Lincoln at Gettysburg. So the battle is one thing, momentous, turning point. Most important battle on American soil in American history, probably after the Battle of Yorktown, which secures our independence. And then Gettysburg Address. There was a time in America when every third grader had to memorize the Gettysburg Address. Trust me, I was there. And it's probably true that every third grade teacher didn't know what the true meaning of the Gettysburg Address was, but it was beautiful and it was important, and we could grab some of the concepts out of it at least. And what does it hurt the third graders to memorize it anyway? 5 months later, after the battle, so the battle was in July of 1863, the Gettysburg Address is given 5 months later in November 1863. Lincoln came to Gettysburg on the battlefield. And so many men had died, both sides, that if you looked carefully, you could see bodies still waiting to be buried 5 months later. And he had two purposes in coming there. And by the way, he was not the primary speaker that day. He was not the keynote. The keynote speaker was the president of Harvard College who would speak for over an hour. And Lincoln had kind of had to worm his way to getting an invitation, and he would speak for 2.5 minutes. 2.5 minutes. This is why third graders can memorize the Gettysburg Address. Well, I don't have to tell you which of these two speeches was more important, right? So 2 reasons. The first was obvious. Every president has to do this after a significant battle or a tragedy, to pay homage, to mourn, to be for a moment the national pastor, to mourn those so tragically slain in the battle, to comfort their relatives and such. In this effort, he said, we have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. So he's comforting the living, honoring the dead. But Lincoln's second purpose was far more important. Not to minimize the first, but the second was what's lastingly significant here, historically significant. So don't confuse the two. This second purpose was a far greater gift to the nation than simply being the national pastor for a few minutes, important as that was. That second purpose, Lincoln refers back to it in the passage I just quoted you, gave their lives that that nation might live. And so the obvious question is, what nation? What kind of nation? What defined that nation that these people gave their lives that it might live? What was this all about? That's what's being said here. Obviously, Lincoln was referring to the United States. But what escaped so many people was that Lincoln's reference was not to the physical United States or even to its people. Rather, it was the two ideas that that nation was founded upon. That that nation might live. And what were those two ideas? He says in the address, so you cannot miss it, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Liberty and equality. Freedom and equity. These are the ideas of that nation. And note Lincoln's emphasis on the significance for both. Therein lies the problem. Emphasizing both, balancing both is hard. It's human nature to go to the simple, the easy. We do it in almost everything we do. Let's eliminate what we can that's complex and difficult, and let's go to the easy and simplify. If you understand that as part of human nature, if you see that in yourself, then sometimes you can counteract that. You can slap yourself and say, no, it's more complex than that. Right? Everything, it seems. Today in our politics, one political party wants to pretty much exclude freedom and liberty and focus on equality. Equality seems to be all that matters to one party. And the other political party wants to kind of ignore equality and emphasize liberty and freedom and do whatever the heck you want. And ignoring equality. Ladies and gentlemen, they're both wrong. In our best moments, we put them together and they balance each other. Conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. These are the two most fundamental American ideals, and we are not at our best when we ignore one or the other. They are the twin pillars upon which any understanding of American history has to be built. Hopefully you are not hearing this for the first time, because I'm not saying this for the first time. In his Gettysburg Address, of course, Lincoln was reminding the people, the American people, with his words of the concept, the idea of equality enshrined in the Constitution of the United States. And if you just wrote that down, cross it out. Because that's not true. Lincoln tells us what his reference is in the very beginning. Here it's helpful to be able to do some old-fashioned math. How does the Gettysburg Address begin? 77 years ago. So you got to know what a score is, and then you got to be able to add it up, right? Gosh, I hate it when it's so complex. But it doesn't sound as poetic, and Lincoln is a poet, to say 87 years ago. Then you got to do the math. 1863, November 87 from that, what is that? Yeah, good. 1776. When was the Constitution written? 1787. The new government doesn't even begin until Washington takes office in 1789. None of those fit the math, do they? That ain't right. It's not the Constitution he's referencing. What's he referencing? Thank you very much. You see, for Abraham Lincoln, the Declaration of Independence was, to exaggerate only slightly, American scripture, okay? The holy document, the reverenced document, perhaps the best expression. Because it's the Declaration of Independence in which Thomas Jefferson wrote about all men being created equal, that is a high aspiration and clearly not the case. Think about it. We're all created equal. We're not all equally good looking. I am testimony to that. We're not all equally intelligent, right? My daughters remind me of that. See. Jefferson wrote those words to apply to our political rights, one person, one vote, and in his day, one man, one vote, right? Okay. And then judicial equality, that if we're accused of a crime, we all get a trial by jury. Is that justice going to be equal? No, 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 because we're not perfect, right? So what Lincoln is saying here, look back, Americans, to the Declaration of Independence, this high expression of our ideals of equality. Jefferson wrote, all men. It's time we lived up to it. Time we lived up to it. That we included all men. You see? Progress in the country for Lincoln required that we live up to this at some point. Why not now? The Constitution doesn't say that. What was a constitutional right? Slavery. The Southerners have the constitutional right to hold slaves. The Constitution doesn't advocate total equality in America, folks. That's why the Republican Party says we have to fix it. That's the revolution of 1860. We want to fix it. The Constitution is a political document, a compromise. Okay? It was then, it is now. We argue over it all the time. We amend it. We change it. We make it fit our needs today. But it's ever evolving. Lincoln says in the Gettysburg Address, it's time for the Constitution to evolve again. He was essentially arguing that the nation had lost its way in those 77 years. Remember that the Founding Fathers had hoped that slavery would eventually die a gradual and natural death. That had not happened. The Founding Fathers would have been shocked to find that we still had slavery in the country in 1863, and more surprised still to find that we were fighting a war over it. So don't think of Lincoln as opposing the Founding Fathers. No, he loved the Founding Fathers. He loved the Declaration of Independence. That's why he's calling the American people to look back at it again. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address recalls the American people to their original ideal, and in the process, redefined what the American people meant by all men are created equal. Change. This is the purpose of the Gettysburg Address, to redefine what the American people mean by that word equal. Lincoln forever changed the standard of the definition of equality in his Gettysburg Address. Now the idea in America would encompass all men, whereas before the Civil War it clearly did not. And so the Gettysburg Address is published in American newspapers over the next couple of days, and the American people then read the Gettysburg Address in their newspaper, and they all slapped themselves in the head and said, yes, that's exactly what we mean, right? No. That is not. History is about learning what human nature is. Those Southerners who actually had access to the Gettysburg Address, and it wouldn't have been all of them, they looked at that, the vast majority of them, and said, to hell with Abraham Lincoln, that's why we're fighting this war. That is not what we think. And sadly, 100 years after that, the majority of Southerners would say the same thing. Yeah. 100 years. And a lot of the Northerners would look at that and they would say, man, I'm not, I hate slavery, but I'm not sure I'm on board for equality. They're two different things. Northerners wanted to get rid of slavery. That's true. Most of them did anyway. But the idea that the black freed man was going to have the same civil rights as me, that's a different question for many Northerners. So we still have a long road to go. But let's not forget the meaning of the moment. That too is wrong. Because something dramatic is changing here in America at Gettysburg. Both because of the battle, but also because of the address. Historian Shelby Foote, one of the great Civil War historians, calls the Civil War the crossroads of our being. The crossroads of our being. He's right. The war made the American people very different than they had been. It was a major step in the development of the ideas of equality and freedom. We don't become a perfect people because of the Civil War. But we become a very different people because of it. Summary. The Battle of Gettysburg had been the turning point of the war. But it was not decisive. The South may yet have won, and the South is still going to come pretty close to winning. Especially if the North grew tired of the conflict. That the peace party, the anti-war sentiment, took over in the North and elected another president in 1864. And if that happened, then that peace candidate would let the South go. Lincoln at Gettysburg, however, had reminded Northerners that while they were fighting to preserve the Union Lincoln sought to preserve was one based on male equality, one of the two best ideas of our founding fathers. After Lincoln spoke at Gettysburg, the meaning of that one word, equality, began to change. It began to change to include all people. As before, it had only included white men. Questions? General Longstreet survives the war. And General Longstreet published his thoughts after the war, and his disagreement with Lee became well known. General Longstreet then became a Republican and became one of the great enemies of the Southerners, even though he had fought on their side. Right? Yeah. Meade's, okay, on the third day, what was Meade's mistake? After the third day, actually. Yeah, he's got the opportunity to chase Lee and catch him as Lee's trying to cross the rivers and annihilate the Southern Army, but he doesn't do it. Anybody have any other questions? Yes?
So Lee decided to move north because of foreign recognition. And what's the other reason?
To inflame anti-war sentiment in the North. If he wins a major victory on Northern ground, the people who are opposed to the war and want peace, people who are sympathetic to the South will be able to have even greater arguments and perhaps carry the day. Yes?
So Lincoln's definition of equality was all men just meant men?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah. No, not women yet. That's a great point, but not women yet. It's all about men still. It was all about white men to start with. Then it becomes all about men. And then in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, women will say, and are already saying at this time to some extent, what about us? But nobody's paying any attention yet. Nobody meaning the majority of the people. Anybody else? All right, remember the 10 bonus points for Tuesday, and I'll see you later.